to a Dram and a Drash, where the water of life meets the tree of life. It's wonderful to be with you, and this month I am delighted that my guest is Rabbi Dr. Denise Handlarski. Denise is the rabbi of secularsynagogue.com, which is an online Jewish community, and she's an ordained humanist rabbi. She also serves as a labor and birth doula, helping people through pregnancy and birth. And she has a PhD in English literature from York University. She teaches at Trent School of Education and Professional Learning. And in that context, most recently, earlier this year, she organized a conference on Jewish responses to the loneliness epidemic. I can't wait to talk to Denise about all these facets and aspects of who she is and what she does, and we'll do so over a dram. So we're welcoming this month Rabbi Dr. Denise Handlarski. Denise, it's so wonderful to have you on a Dram and a Drash. Thank you so much for joining me today. And we're going to jump right in. Please do tell us, what is the Dram that you are bringing to us this month?
Okay, well, I'm very delighted to be here. Thank you for having me. And here is a little bit of Laphroaig, which I have the quarter cask bottle. There are sort of different varieties available. And the reason I really like it is its peatiness. I like a peaty scotch. Not everybody does, but even the smoky smell, everything about it just brings me a lot of pleasure. So this is what I have today.
Well, that's great. And I'm joining you. I actually have a few behind me, but I poured myself the Laphroaig 10. The Laphroaig 10 now does also come in a cask strength edition, but this is the one where they've already added the water, and it's one of their best sellers. But I also have this one here is the quarter cask, of course, is delicious. This is something you can only get when you're traveling. So for those who have gotten back on planes again, that you'll find this in some airports. I got this at Heathrow on my way back from the UK this summer. The PX cask, so finished in Pedro Ximenez, which is a very rich, sweet sherry. So if you can imagine taking something super peaty and smoky, then having that kind of blended in with the notes of something very sweet. It's a very interesting, beautiful balance. I have one other here, and this one, I'm afraid, you have to go all the way to Isle of Four, and I'll talk about that a little bit. This is a small bottle that I got to pull directly from a cask at the warehouse when I had a tour of Laphroaig this past summer. It was a lifelong dream to go to Isla, but I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in just a moment. First of all, let's take a little taste and see if we can describe for people a little bit more about what we're picking up. And obviously, we've got two slightly different versions here. So,
L'chaim.
Yeah, I know for me that, it's funny that the notes that I get when I take a smell, whiskey, one of the lovely things about whiskey is the way it can really invoke a memory or a place and take you somewhere. And I am a big, big fan of being by the sea, being by the sea air. And I just get that immediate hit of sea salt, and I'm right there again. So what comes up for you when you're smelling and tasting the whiskey?
To me, it's just there's a smoky sweetness that I really appreciate about Laphroaig. I don't feel like I have the salt, but I'm going to taste it again to see if I grab it.
Yeah,
and I really like the it kind of has a delicious burn. I like the feel of it, but it's not overpowering, and the sweetness balances it. And then it gives you that kind of, particularly now that we're in the colder months, it gives you that kind of warming feeling.
absolutely. And I'm remembering, so you've got the quarter cask, which means that it's finished in these smaller size casks, which what that is effectively doing is you're going to get a little bit more of the whiskey in touch with the wood. So you're going to get more of what the wood lends the flavor of the whiskey. So the peatiness is coming from that process of how they smoke, peat the barley. And I'm going to say something about that in just a second,
Great.
because I've got some pictures behind me that are very relevant to that. But then what you're getting, when you talked about you're getting that balance of the sweetness, I would expect, it's been a while since I've tasted the quarter cask, but I'd expect you to get a little bit more of the sweetness, a little bit more of the vanilla, because that is the version of Laphroaig that's been sitting in these smaller barrels. And that's exactly the side of the flavor profile that you're going to get from the wood that they've put it in to do that. So yours will taste different to mine in that very specific way, I think.
Right. That sounds
so maybe
right.
that's why I'm getting a little bit more of the salt. I just added a couple of drops of water. Sometimes, that brings out something a little different. Yeah, and what's interesting is for me, on the 10-year-old, I get it, the vanilla comes forward a little bit more once I've added just a little bit of water to open it up, and also a little bit more of like the peppery notes. There's also something else. I mean, it's interesting that Laphroaig is one of those whiskeys that people often use descriptors for, and I discussed this a little bit with Rabbi Brad Hirschfeld in my first episode, because he really prefers the Speyside things that are not heavily peated at all.
Right.
And although Dalwhinnie, which he was discussing, has just a tiny little bit of peat in it. But we were talking about how some whiskeys get described as like iodine and Band-Aids and tires. And with words you go like, why would you want to taste that? But Laphroaig is one that gets those kinds of descriptors to them. And there's the iodine piece. People talk about, when people talk about Band-Aids, I have this memory of being a child in the 1970s. And if you like scratched you fell in the playground when you were at school, and you got to see the nurse, they put this like stuff, it was kind of like an antiseptic stuff, like TCP. And not that anybody would want to be drinking something that reminds them of that, but there is an element of, it's an element that's there, and it brings back that. It's actually a soothing memory, because it's like, it's a healing memory. And so it's but that's part of Laphroaig as well. Yeah. So it's a wonderful example of an Islay whiskey. And it probably, for me, one of the first ones I ever had of a peaty nature that I went, oh, I get it now. Because I think my first ever experience of a peaty whiskey, I grew up in a family that was really much more into the Speysides or blended whiskeys, something that was much smoother. And when I had my first taste of a really peaty whiskey, it was friends near in my congregation who were into things like Kalila and Ardbeg. And the first time I had those, I just felt like somebody punched me in the face.
Right, it's too much.
This was not a whiskey. Right, but there was something about that balance you talked about between the peat and the sweetness in the Laphroaig. They get it just right. Yeah,
I really agree with you.
So tell me a little bit about your exposure to Laphroaig, and I know you had told me a while back a really heartwarming story of sort of how Laphroaig can connect, which might be a very nice theme for where we'll be going in our conversation today.
Indeed. Well, so I got introduced to Laphroaig by my friend who actually owns a lovely bar here in Toronto where I live. It's called the Bluebird. If anybody's ever in Toronto, please go check it out. And she started stocking it in her bar, and a lot of her customers really loved it for all the reasons we've talked about. People who weren't normally so into the scotches and the whiskeys were saying, this is really delicious and I love it. And she gave me a bottle, and I loved it too. And then, running a bar it's all hands on deck all the time. And she was working a lot, but we did spend this very snowy, wintry weekend. We got a cabin with a fireplace, and we decided to just sort of go up there and hole up and spend some time together, because we don't have the opportunity to spend as much time together now that she's running the bar. We were in there, and we were drinking Laphroaig, and it was getting a little bit late when all of a sudden someone was banging at our door. And, it's a little bit horror movie-esque. You're in a cabin in the woods, and someone starts knocking it wasn't a gentle knock. Someone was really banging. And so we weren't sure whether we should open the door, but we decided to see who it was. And it was this couple, and they were staying in the cabin sort of near to us, and they had accidentally somehow locked themselves out, but they were really worried because their dog was inside and the fire was going, and they were worried about the fire and the dog and how to get back in. And it's the kind of place there's no staff around, so we were just trying to figure out how to, without causing property damage, break in so that they could get back inside and be with their dog. And other people in other cabins, there's sort of a series of cabins all on the same lake, they noticed us sort of trying to break into one of the cabins. So they at first thought it was a security issue, and they came out to check it out. And in the end, there were sort of 4 or 5 cabins worth of people all trying to help these people back inside. Someone was able to jimmy the lock and get them back in, which was amazing. But it was a real bonding experience. And then we started just sharing the Laphroaig with all of the others who had come to join. And we had, on this very snowy, cold Canadian night, a glass of warming Laphroaig all together, and sort of toasted to our being able to rescue the dog and get those people back inside, but also just some of those moments of camaraderie that that can rise in times where somebody needs help.
Yeah. Oh, it's a wonderful story, and I think it's memorable. And yes, the Laphroaig is not essential to the coming together, but it is a very nice way to provide that sense of connection and warming on a cold night. It's all about those things, winter and fireplaces. And so, right, you can like smell the fire going as, with the Laphroaig going alongside it. So it is in all ways a very heartwarming story. So before we move off of the Dram and onto some more of the Drash, which there's so much to try and cover today, and what I'd love people to know about you, I would like to just say just a couple of other things about Laphroaig for people who are interested in the whiskey. As I intimated, I've got some pictures behind me that I've had up since I started recording. This is only a couple of months into my recording, the first half of season 1. But you can see over here, I have a picture of the Laphroaig distillery. This is the view from the water. And I had taken a boat trip, so we got to kind of see a number of the ones that are right against the water there. And Laphroaig is on a strip of the island of Islay, where there's 3 in a row. You've got Laphroaig, and you've got Lagavulin, and you've got Ardbeg, all in that side of the island. And of course, being on the water, historically, that's, the docking area makes it easy for them to transport their whiskey. Then behind me, this was the only distillery when I was visiting in Islay this summer that I took a tour, and it was an in-depth tour. I got to see the process from the beginning to the end. A lot of distilleries these days do not malt their own barley. The process of malting and whether they're adding peat or not, that's something that oftentimes distilleries these days, they get their malted barley from a place where that's all they're doing. And there is a place on Islay that does that, the Port Ellen Maltings. They are creating malted barley for a lot of the distilleries there, including Laphroaig. Laphroaig doesn't malt enough for all of its production, but they malt some of their own barley. And so there's a floor where you can see the barley being germinated. And then the pictures behind me where you can see the smoke just above my head, that's where the peat is being exposed to the smoke that's coming from the peat in the fire that is this picture here. And so this is the floor above. And what's interesting and rather unique about Laphroaig is that they do it in such a way that the smoke that's coming up into where the barley is cold. Mm. Most distilleries, when they're peating, you think about it's a fire, it's going to be hot, but they do it in such a way that the smoke is cold. And that's because they don't want to dry out the barley at that time. They are intentionally smoking wet barley. And so some of those things that the flavor profile that you get, especially some of the iodine kind of notes, that's a direct result of this very specific process. And it's really interesting to watch how they do it. And then afterwards, they turn up the temperature. And this picture over here is now, once it's already been smoked for 17 hours, now they are drying the barley before it's continue on its journey through the process. Couple of other sort of random pieces of information that I think is rather cool and interesting. First of all, Laphroaig's been around since 1815, so they celebrated their 200th anniversary, and for a good chunk of that time, they were family-owned, independent. That's not been the case for a while now. Most of these distilleries are now bought up by companies and then sold on to other companies, and they're with the Beam Suntory company these days. But one of the things about Laphroaig was that early on in the history, in the 1800s, they already had a reputation for the specific whiskey that was coming out of their distillery. And so people wanted Laphroaig's whiskey. Most of the whiskey that was being made up until the 1980s was just going into blended whiskey. So different distilleries were making them, and people knew who blended, where they wanted to get their whiskey from. But most of us who were buying, we were buying blended whiskies. We wouldn't be buying labels that had the name of a specific distillery. But Laphroaig had that reputation very early on, doing a single malt whiskey, and that's quite unusual as well. And then the final piece of information that I just found really interesting is that, I'll show you the bottle again, bring it up close here. So this, at the top of the bottle, this is not found on many bottles of whiskey. What you're seeing there is the coat of arms for what was the Prince of Wales, Prince Charles, now King Charles of England. That's called a royal warrant, and products only get royal warrants if a member of the royal family likes a product enough that they're actually regularly stocking it in, for their parties, for their, their castles and so on. And so there's a couple of other whiskies that have the warrant of actually the Queen, but this is the warrant of Prince Charles, and he particularly loves Laphroaig. He gave it the warrant in the mid-90s, and then he was back again in the 2000s to celebrate, and so he's a big fan of Laphroaig. So for what that's worth, you're now in the company of kings when you are drinking Laphroaig.
I love that. I did not know that. I'm so delighted to have learned that. That's beautiful.
So I'm going to take another little dram of that, and let's shift gears a little bit. Denise, we got to connect because we're part of a network called Rabbis Without Borders, which is part of a project of Klal, and it's a wonderful way for rabbis of all different denominations and no denominations and backgrounds to come together, share wisdom, and share ideas. And so that's this wonderful place of sort of cross-fertilization of different approaches where we all learn so much from each other. And so I'm particularly delighted to have a chance to speak with you, because I don't think many of the people who I normally interact with in my work as a Reformed congregational rabbi in the suburb of Massachusetts have the opportunity to meet someone who is a humanist rabbi running an online community out of Toronto. So let's start there. Tell people a little bit about who you are. What does it mean to be a humanist rabbi? And a little bit, for those who are unfamiliar with the idea, a little bit about humanist Judaism.
Great. So thank you. Humanistic Judaism is a movement that was started by a Reform rabbi, actually, named Rabbi Sherwin Wine. And he, I guess around 55 years ago, was feeling that he didn't want to lead prayer services where he didn't believe in the words of the prayers that he was leading. And he suspected he had a number of congregants who also didn't believe in those words. And he wanted to start a community where one of the core values was that folks got to say things that they really believe. And so that continues to be a core value in terms of speaking out for justice or different kinds of things. But we really believe that people should take words seriously. We know words can be incredibly powerful. And, definitely if you believe in the words of prayer, that's beautiful to say, but it sort of cheapens those prayers when people who don't believe in those words say them. And we find alternate liturgy that people do believe in. So very earth-centered, kind of the human experience being crucial to what we do in our services. So we have some things that we've simply adapted from traditional liturgy or holiday celebrations. And we have some things that we've completely remade. And so when you come to a humanistic congregation, whether it's in person or online. I guess for your folks closest to you, Boston has one. Then it's an opportunity to see how people are putting a cultural expression of Judaism at the center. And rather than prayer-based services, we come together to do study, to do social justice work, to do all different kinds of activities. But as I said, earth-centered and human-centered.
Right. So I think you touched on something that is interesting to me, which is that, there's a changing of language when it comes to liturgy, but there's also a changing, I think, from what you're describing, for many humanist communities, of focus. Because one of the questions I have is sort of, what is ritual? What is prayer when the language is changed, and perhaps we're framing it in a way where there's not an explicit addressing of some greater power or something sort of beyond the human that we experience in the world. So to say a little bit more about that. Am I representing that correctly?
Yes, I think so. So, for example, and I think there's a difference sometimes between prayer or blessing and ritual. They're connected, but they differ from each other. But we do humanist or secular blessings. So, for example, this isn't wine, but normally on Shabbat, if we have a glass of wine, people might be familiar with the traditional blessing, which starts with being grateful for divine presence. Instead, we just put our focus on the actual grapes, the people who bring forth the wine out of grapes. So there are different versions, but some of them bless, the suns and the rains that bring forth the fruit of the vine. Others focus more on the workers that bring forth the fruit of the vine, or we can simply focus on gratitude for the sweetness and beauty of wine, or in this case, possibly Laphroaig. And it allows us to engage with that Jewish tradition of offering a blessing before consuming, but also doing it, as I said, with words that do resonate. So that's one example. But other examples, I think, around ritual, there are many things that are in Jewish practice that some are widely practiced, some are less practiced. But for example, at Shabbat, having candles and wine and challah, having an opportunity to take time for rest. Some of those rituals are, deeply important for serving human needs, particularly, through the ages, certainly. But now we live in a very busy time, a very sort of stress-filled time. And I think it's, for some of us, even more crucial that we make time for those sorts of things. So we engage with the traditions of Judaism and find expressions that meet people where they're at in terms of their belief and practice. And I'll say, because you mentioned I run an online community, so I was the first sort of explicitly fully online community, which was before the pandemic. I didn't have a crystal ball to know that was going to happen, forcing people online in all kinds of ways. But I started it in 2018. And, as you said, not everybody has a humanistic congregation near where they are. Some people live in very small towns. And I knew that this was something that could connect people with Judaism in ways that maybe they were not feeling connected. And also some practical things that, after the pandemic, or, now that we're here in the stages of the pandemic, a lot of people recognize some of the benefits of doing some work online. At that time, I had very young children, so it was just very hard to get out for an evening of any kind of programming. And I was just sort of exhaustedly scrolling on my phone at the end of the day. And I was thinking, what if this was where people came to connect with Jewish teaching, Jewish ritual, Jewish community? It seemed possible, and I wanted to try it. And now, of course, lots of folks have done a lot of online Judaism in the last couple of years. So some people who were more skeptical understand it better, but we were already meeting in that way, which allows us to have an international community. So it's very special that folks come together, and part of our goal is to create meaningful community, not just programming online. So we have people from all over the world who will join. And the last thing I'll say about it is this is one of our we have a little bit of swag that says more joy, less oi. It's one of our approaches to, there's a lot of oi related to Jewish life. And of course there is, we deal with anti-Semitism and all kinds of problems. But I think a lot of people have also been turned off of Judaism when all they hear about is the negative. So we really want to bring back a sense of Jewish joy for folks as well.
Yeah, yeah, it's wonderful that you did, through happenstance, have that opportunity to begin to build that. As you said before, we all knew how essential it would be, and I think that in some ways that really put you in a slightly different place of awareness when, a lot of rabbis were really just scrambling to learn the basics of the technology and figure out how to do services, and as often happens, the first thing you do when you start on something is you do what you were doing, but now you just, face a screen. Right. And I think the places and the communities that really thrived were ones that figured out quickly that you couldn't just do what you did, but now on screen. You had to use the interface of the fact that it was virtual, the fact that it was online, to actually change. I mean, I know we did that. I was blown away by the rabbi educator, Joe Iderson, who works at my congregation, who within 2 weeks we had school up and running.
Wow.
But it was, before we had a 3-hour program where you went from this to this to this, you couldn't do that. It was, it was a 50-minute, 1-hour program. It was a little bit of this, a little bit of that. And more than anything else, he understood right from the get-go, it was about kids seeing their friends. Mm-hmm. It was about seeing each other and connecting and sharing and, grabbing something from the house and showing it and saying so. It was very different to what school would have been if it had been in person. And I think one of the reasons, aside from being just an excellent educator, that he got that was because also he has a lot of experience having grown up through summer camp and understanding what happens in that bonding experience in a camp setting. And so that continues to infuse how we run school, but it then got translated. Well, how can you create some of that feeling or that sense now that we're doing this?
Beautiful.
So tell me a little bit about, what you had learned, from doing it for 2 years before everybody was doing it. Tell me a little bit about how you do go about trying to create that sense of community and belonging when people may see each other at no other time than when they log on to a Zoom or whatever technology you're using.
Right. So, our whole thing from the start has been connecting community more than Jewish events. And I think you're right. I think a lot of folks were like, how do we run our events online? Which is important. We all need to have events, but less of a focus on bringing people together. And I'm delighted to hear that that was one of the focuses for the students you serve because I think we'll talk about this later, but it's been a very lonely time for people. And to me, one of the most important things about Judaism is that it connects folks. And we have a lot of important, rituals and traditions in place that are designed to connect people. The tradition that you need a minyan to pray. You can't do it all by yourself. The idea that we come together for life cycle events. We come together for Shiva at a time of mourning for people. We don't do things alone. And it's really baked into the structures of Judaism. And I wanted to bring that to an online space. So we do come together by Zoom, and it was funny, some of the rabbis without borders fellows were, at the start of the pandemic, like, you already use Zoom, tell me how to do it. So we had that. But we also have a very active Facebook group where, so Facebook is how, for example, instead of a formal sermon on Fridays, I do, we call it a Shabbat Live. I just do a Facebook Live, and I might talk about Torah. I might talk about just what's going on in the world, but that's how I do some of my rabbinic work. But because it's a Facebook group, we have all kinds of things that we do, and people do engage with it daily. So right now, for the last few weeks, we've had a photo challenge every day, a different thing. So show us your pets. Today, it's of course show us. We're recording this on Halloween. I don't know when it'll come out, but folks are showing Halloween costumes, and that's a way to get to know each other. And it was a bit of an experiment. began, I didn't know whether people would connect. And we really do have people, we have people in Mexico and Argentina, all over North America, Canada, and the US, from sort of coast to coast and all the way through the middle. We have a lot of folks in Europe. Actually, our Team UK members, we have some in Scotland, so they'll be excited about our exploration here of parts of, the exports from their place. And people really do feel connected. And I'll give an example just from a couple of weeks ago, which was incredibly moving to me. And one of the things I wouldn't have anticipated, but it just was so lovely. It didn't, the cause for this is very sad, actually. We have members who are longtime members, and it's sweet how they actually joined the community. So they're an intermarried couple, and the person who's Jewish joined first and loved it and said, I think my partner would really love this. And for the kind of Christmas season, he wanted to get her a membership as a gift. And then she just joined on her own, knowing how much her partner was getting out of it. And I said, your gift is ruined. You have to find something else. So that was lovely a few years ago. And then just recently they had a baby, which was so beautiful, and everyone was so excited, sharing baby photos. And then sadly, she got quite sick and was hospitalized right around when they were learning the baby had serious allergies. So there were all of these health concerns. These two, they live in Montreal. So, one of the things we thought we could do to support is help find formula. There are all these formula shortages right now, and the baby requires a very particular kind of formula because of the allergies. And, if we were all in Montreal, I would not have felt comfortable saying, let's find it everywhere and clear it out, because there are other babies who also need that formula. But we are all over the world, and people sent formula from the UK, from California, from Detroit, from, all over the place. These, crates of formula keep arriving at their door. And everyone was so excited to have a way we could really support from our, places all over the world. And it really meant a lot to them to feel held in community. And that's just one example of the things that we can do when we really try to foster meaningful connection online. So we see each other in Zooms, we interact all the time in the Facebook group. We have a book club and a film club. So, we do crafts together. Sometimes we just have booze and schmooze afternoons. So all of these ways for people to really get to know each other, in addition to all of the actual programming we're doing around text learning or having speakers or this sort of thing.
Wow. Yeah, that's a wonderful example. And you're right. And something where the spread of the community actually became its strength.
Right.
So knowing what is specific and unique about a particular community, and then playing to that strength, right? As opposed to here's what a synagogue or a congregation is meant to be, and pushing that out without thinking about the dynamics of the very specific elements that make up your community, which I think is a lesson for anybody in any community, whether it's, brick and mortar or, not in a building or online. That's a lesson. So I know that in addition to doing your work as a rabbi, there's a lot of things that you do, and you also have an academic background and work in academia. And so earlier this year, you convened an event that was really on this subject, looking, I think it was going to look at my notes, gathering Jewish responses to the loneliness epidemic. And this was something I talked about this year at the High Holy Days. The sociologists who have been researching this, there have been measures in showing an increase in that self-reported sense of loneliness, really going back to the mid-90s. So it's not a brand new issue, but it certainly was exacerbated by what the pandemic brought on people, and that isolation, and that having to, really keep away from people. So tell us a little bit about the research you've done, and some of what you've gleaned both from your own experiences, but also from bringing other voices in for that conversation about what we as Jewish communities can be doing to be that response. What are the things that any of us, whether we're part of a community, a member of a community, somebody who's just listening and who isn't part of a community but is wondering, what could I get if I put myself into community in this way? What are some of the biggest things you'd want us to be thinking about?
Right. Well, so yes, also before the pandemic, I became really passionate about this. I was feeling just sort of the weight of disconnection for people. I believe, again, this was before the pandemic. We live in a very lonely time, although ironically, we're very connected. So we're on our devices all the time with people. You can chat with someone from anywhere in the world anytime you want to. And we do some of that, and we sort of put parts of our lives up on social media. But then at the end of the day, on studies, people consistently report, would anybody show up for me for childcare if I needed some assistance? Do you have somebody to bring you soup when you're feeling sick? These sorts of things. So although we're constantly connected, we're also very disconnected and feeling that we have to manage everything on our own. We used to live in much better supportive families and communities where there would be lots of extended family around or different kinds of people helping out. And now I think we live in a time where we don't want to impose on each other. Everybody's very busy and we feel like we can't ask for help. So there are lots of pieces. And we also know that a lot of, and this is certainly not particular to the Jewish world, but a lot of traditional religious communities are not finding people joining in the same number. So we have churches closing everywhere, for example. And that is only exacerbating a problem where people don't know always where to find community. And some of the ways people are finding community are expensive and sort of exclusive, that you can join. A lot of people talk about, for example, finding CrossFit or Soul Cycle to be places of great community, so exercise communities, but those are very expensive to join and certainly not for everybody. So where do you go if you need community? And I got a grant. It's called the Social Sciences Humanities Research Council of Canada, and they fund different kinds of research. And their call was actually about, in their words, the emerging asocial society. And part of it was the loneliness epidemic. So I said, as I said earlier, I think we in our spiritual communities do offer a lot. And some of the landscape is changing. I have an online community. We all shifted online during the pandemic. People do all kinds of creative things, but there's this sort of sense that, oh yeah, it's that traditional stuff I did as a kid and I didn't love it. And so they might not be drawn to it now. So part of it in this gathering was to come together to share all kinds of dynamic things that people are doing to make folks excited. So as one example, we had one table who they'll fund folks coming together for Shabbat dinner in each other's homes, and sometimes online now. And they had all this kind of research to back up their work and how it's really getting people to feel connected in a different kind of way. We did have different rabbis and also Hillel folks, some of the kind of more traditional side of Judaism, talking about the dynamic ways that they're bringing people together. And we also had academics. So we had Len Sachs from Brandeis and Alana Horowitz from Tulane, who have been researching the loneliness epidemic and how it's impacting Jewish community in particular. So we did some learning, we did some sharing, but also it was an opportunity for us to connect. It was held in May, and a lot of people had not been to in-person gatherings for a long time. And so with as much sort of COVID safety in place as we could, we actually wanted to get people together, just chatting with each other, sharing food together, having an opportunity to connect. We did it both in person and online so that folks could connect. And out of it, we created a website. So the website is bit.ly/expressions of belonging, or if you Google Jewish responses to the loneliness epidemic, it also comes up. But we share on there all the videos from the amazing presenters. There are just too many for me to go into. They were so rich and varied, and so moving, and also some of the kind of literature on this. And I had the various speakers write what we call promising practices papers. So that's where folks really want to do a deep dive. There's all of these promising practices for what's working to connect people in Jewish community.
Yeah, no, thank you. I have explored it. And for those who didn't catch that, in the notes that go, whether you're listening on the audio version or YouTube, if you look at the notes that go with this episode, you'll get the link to look at that. It's a great resource. I was only able to listen to some of it. I was a virtual watcher online. I dipped in and out, but I'm so pleased to have been able to go back to that resource. And as I said, it became a big theme, a focus of the sermons that I gave and some of the things that we did over the High Holy Days. So I'm just want to say thank you for that resource. It was particularly the background and the research. It was really helpful to be able to frame what we're thinking about, why we're thinking about it, and some of the work that we're trying to do within our own congregation to address some of this. I'm really thinking about what does belonging mean for the individual, not for the institution, right? It's not about membership. It's about belonging and who you are and how your presence makes a difference, and helping you to connect with others with those shared points of connection. So it's been, I think it's where the focus has been on and off in conversations in Jewish communities for a number of years. I think that these last couple of years have really helped people recognize how important it is for this to really be the focus of our work in so many ways. It comes back to actually sort of where we began our conversation, because I know that for me, one of the things that I find myself grappling with in balance is what we really need to be doing is focusing on the needs of the community, people who are Jewish families, and people who are adjunct to that, who they are today. Reform Judaism is very much about recognizing that we're constantly evolving and things change, and it's who we are today. At the same time, we are the inheritors of this incredible civilization, and there's some of what we continue to do. And for me, and this is where if we were to go back to words and what they mean, we might think about these things a little differently, you and I. But there's something to me very powerful about uttering things that have been said a certain way for a very long period of time, even though I understand something about how those words were sort of birthed into existence, why liturgy was written the way it was, and I'm maybe reinterpreting in my own time. But I think we're constantly playing with that balance as a Jewish community of how to constantly be meeting the needs of what's right in front of us and who we are today, and yet there is something about needing to honor and know and understand and bring with us something of this civilization that, it's thousands of years old at this point. So I don't know, is that something you find yourself thinking about? Sort of where's that line for you about how you try and say on the one hand and on the other hand and try and address both of those?
Right. I mean, this is the central question. I believe we all need to grapple with it, no matter where we're at, in terms of faith, because one of the things that really came out in the research on loneliness and belonging is so many people have felt, because of the multiple facets of their identities, unwelcome in Jewish spaces. So that could be about race or gender or sexuality, being intermarried, not believing in God. A lot of people have said that, that just turned them off when people said, well, then there's no place for you here. So one aspect is that we just need a lot of choices. And we're very lucky to be living in a time where there are a lot of choices, some in person, some online. But I just encourage folks to figure out what you need from community and seek it out. And my guess is you will find it. So that's one piece. But in humanistic Judaism, we often say tradition gets a vote, but not a veto. So I certainly agree that there's something beautiful about having a Passover Seder where you are engaging with, a very old tradition that has been maintained throughout history and across the world. And we can, dip the parsley and tell the story and have the matzah and do all of these very traditional things. And we can also maybe add newer things to the Seder plates. A lot of people put in orange for queer inclusion, or they added sunflower seeds to be in support of Ukraine this past year. Of course, that's not something we've done before. So to me, there's beautiful play and meaning in finding the balance between tradition and newness. I certainly find there are parts of our traditions that are unacceptable to me from an ethical perspective in terms of our contemporary ethics. So, I reject the homophobia of traditional Judaism. I reject the patriarchal nature of a lot of traditional Judaism, but that doesn't mean that I have to reject all of it. There's beauty and wisdom in so much of it. And this is one of the reasons I think to connect Jewishly, because you get to find out what does resonate. It was just recently Simchat Torah, so we ran a program on why would secular Jews read Torah? And there are so many great reasons to engage with tradition. It doesn't mean you have to take every word literally. I don't believe anybody takes every word literally anymore. But there's a
Right.
power to the fact that these are our stories and we did inherit them, and we can join the tradition of being interpreters. I think there's lots of beauty and power in that, certainly. So yeah, so that tension between tradition and modernity, between reconciling our many beliefs with our Jewish past, I think that's some of the beauty of what we get to do.
Right, right. And we're called God wrestlers for a reason, right? The children of Yisrael, literally the one who wrestled with God. So that's part of the path, which in itself is a calling. I can't tell you the number of people who have come to me from other backgrounds, traditions, and have found their way to Judaism because that's what's special about who we are, that they can grapple and argue and ask questions and choose what to accept and what to leave on the shelf. And it's all part of the process of being Jewish and living Jewishly. You're not told that if you don't believe this one particular way that you don't belong. It's the grappling with that is being part of that's really what we're about. Yeah, very much so. Well, Denise, this has been such a pleasure to get to spend time in conversation with you. I'm so glad that we bonded over one of my favorite Isla Drams, Laphroaig, and a wonderful opportunity for people to get to know who you are and the work that you do. And I look forward to opportunities to connect again, both in person and online. But for this episode, I want to just say thank you and L'chaim.
Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure. L'chaim.
L'chaim. Well, thank you for joining me on another episode of A Dram and a Drash. I hope you've enjoyed the conversation with Denise, and please look at the episode notes for information on where you can find out more about her community, and her project from the Gathering Conference. I also want to encourage you, please, if you're enjoying what you're listening to, do subscribe to the podcast wherever you're listening. Leave us a review. If you are watching the YouTube video podcast, please subscribe there. And if you're enjoying this, please spread the word. Pass it on to family and friends. We would love to enjoy a dram and a drush with them. I'd also love to hear from you with any ideas that you have. If you happen to be a Jewish professional who enjoys a dram and would like to be in a conversation on a future episode, please be in touch. And if you happen to be Jewish and are a whiskey professional, I would love to hear from you and have you on the show as well. Until next time, l'chaim.